Once again, welcome to Oxford Computer Group's webinar series. This month we'll be talking about passwordless authentication, and as the title suggests, as you can see on the screen, securing your organization with passwordless authentication. So again, thank you for joining us. Hopefully this will be very informative for you, and it'll give you some idea of what you can do today to begin securing your organizations against the current threats that are out there. For our agenda today, just 4 main topics. We're going to look at the current state. This, of course, just sets the tone, lets us know why we're talking about this topic, why passwordless authentication is so important. We did a webinar on this about 2 years ago in August of 2020. And so this is sort of a follow-up covering a little bit more detail and steps that organizations can begin to take as the second bullet item suggests, there strategies for managing your current state. We know Rome wasn't built in a day, and there's going to be things you need to do today, even with passwords in the environment, to better secure your resources and your estate. And so we'll have some pointers there. We'll talk about the what's of passwordless authentication, exactly what it is and what we're trying to accomplish, and then how you can start your passwordless journey. Quick background on Oxford Computer Group. We are a Microsoft Gold partner, so we deal mainly in the Microsoft ecosystem for identity and security systems and identity governance. Oxford Computer Group has been around for over 20 years, and we have a proven track record on deploying hybrid identity solutions. We've deployed over 900 different enterprise projects around the world, and we've been named Microsoft Identity Partner 8 times, and also with our other partner, Savient, around identity governance, have been Impact Partner twice. And with our connections with the Microsoft engineering team and also Savient engineering teams, we have particular insight into those platforms and how they can be deployed in your environment. Okay, so getting underway, this is our typical kind of why we're talking about this. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? And of course, we know passwords are the problem. Passwords are expensive and vulnerable to breaches, and just some by the numbers of why we can say that. And some of the content here is taken from the Verizon data breach investigation report, of which, if you're a regular reader of that report, the 2022 report was just released on May 24th, just a few days ago, and I was able to go through it. The numbers here largely are representative of last year's numbers, but from last year to this year, things have not changed, and in some respects, they've even gotten worse. For instance, ransomware attacks, as you're probably aware of, are up 13%, which represents a really big jump from the previous 5 years. But as far as passwords are concerned, we know the problems, right? 63% of workers admit to reusing passwords, and reused passwords are a #1 vector for how credentials are stolen and misused. Passwords are in 89% of the breaches that the Verizon data breach investigation report studied. 89% of the breaches were due to leveraged passwords, stolen credentials, hacked credentials, phished credentials. And so we see it represents a huge vector and an easy vector that attackers are still leveraging. The expense from those attacks, of course, over almost $4 million is the average cost of a data breach. Last year, we saw some very high-level attacks. Colonial Pipeline was due to a compromised password. JBS USA, was a food processor, also was through a relatively minor breach or minor lapse in security, where a network admin's account that had not been disabled, that network admin was no longer there, had a very weak password associated with it, and that ended up costing them $11 million in the ransomware attack. So we see that there's a very high cost in passwords, and even in just management of passwords. 30 to 50% of help desk calls are related to password reset. And according to one study, each one will cost around $70 to $80 in terms of manpower and you know, what goes into managing those help desk calls just for password resets. And part of the issue is that you know, enterprise environments are slow to change, and we realize that in many cases it's not easy to turn on a dime and to implement some of these strategies. But for instance, many organizations have still not implemented NIST's recommendations for passwords. NIST recommends no longer requiring complex passwords or forced password resets, as an example. But many organizations still are clinging to the old policies of, you know, the 90-day password reset, complexity requirements, character requirements, and length requirements. And amazingly, and this data is pretty much fresh from a couple months ago, according to Microsoft, only 22% of Microsoft 365 customers that have Azure AD and have access to Azure MFA have enabled it in their environments. And overall, only 38% of enterprises have generally adopted MFA strategies. And if you'll allow me just a minute for a little indulgence, this came up recently as I was, probably no surprise, a Star Trek fan, watching one of the more recent, newer series, Star Trek Discovery, and I was amazed at the fact that the writers of that show can come up with some pretty fantastic ideas. For instance, Discovery, the ship, very advanced. It's able to use what they call a spore drive to instantly transport them anywhere in the galaxy. They don't even need warp anymore, although they do have access to that. They can use the spore drive to get anywhere. And yet in one of the episodes, as I sat there watching and kind of, you know, preparing me for this webinar, there's a scene where they have to get access to some very important medicine, and the person who has access to that particular resource essentially was able to unlock the resource by uttering just a password, which happened to be the names of his daughters, which also happened to be the names of the moon from the planet he was from. I say all that to say that here, you know, in this show, they have the writers have the ability to give us all this fantastic science fiction. The show takes place 1100 years in the future, but they could not come up with another concept of how to access a resource except for using a password. I just found that amusing and said, I hope that's not the case 1100 years from now, when we're still leveraging passwords to access our resources, that we've come up with something better. And we know we have, because we've done it today, and that's what we're here to talk about. So some best practices around managing the current state. Number one, MFA. Enable MFA. This has been said over and over again, but as the previous slide showed, only 22% of Microsoft customers that have access to MFA have not enabled in their environment, and 38% overall. And there's plenty of choices out there. Of course, there's third-party resources. There's Duo and Centrify, and Okta has Okta Verify. There are a lot of options for enabling MFA in an environment. And the fact is that if you are an Azure AD customer, if you're using Office 365, MFA is free. You don't need a premium license to use it. It's available to anyone with an Azure AD tenant who's, you know, synchronizing their on-premise identities to Azure AD or is in a cloud-only environment. MFA is freely available. It just needs to be enabled. And we know that it's effective. 99% of breaches that are credential-based are eliminated by simply enabling MFA. And some MFA is better than no MFA. And I put that there just to highlight that. Some say, well, I don't want to use SMS-based because that's all I can do right now. And yes, we know the issues around SMS-based text messages for codes. But in some cases, if that's all you have available, doing that is better than nothing, because the likelihood that someone's phone is going to get SIM swapped or hijacked in that way, it's still pretty low. And having MFA protection for those accounts, even using that form of MFA, is still better than nothing. Of course, we want to aim for phishing-resistant MFA, which would include things like biometrics, hardware security keys, number matching if you're using an authenticator app, some type of push notification, although we know even with push notification now, that could be social engineered, and one of the breaches this year that was used effectively, and basically, after the user's credentials had been stolen, they were just constantly pinging that device with those prompts, and some users were getting so fed up that they were just hitting approve. So we want to go with these phishing resistant methods, like as mentioned, number matching, or tokens, software or hardware-based tokens. Another thing you can do starting today is start adopting that password guidance, right? NIST wrote that guidance in 2017. Microsoft then built on top of that and issued some guidance in addition to that from studying the issue with passwords and how breaches happen. And again, NIST requirements basically are saying end the algorithmic complexity, essentially requiring special characters in a password. All it does is it makes it more difficult for users to remember their passwords, or they just reuse a variation of that password, or they use well-known substitutes, @ for A's, 3's for E's, 1's for exclamation marks, and the like, and they become easily guessable by attackers, but forgettable by the users, and so they resort to writing them down on Post-it notes. And the force periodic resets of passwords, and instead move to a model where it's risk-based, using AI, machine learning, to be able to identify if a user sign-in has a risk associated with it. Something like impossible travel or signing in from an unknown location, and only require password resets when something is triggered, when there's an alarm that goes off saying that the user's sign-in is at risk. And also, you want to screen against commonly used passwords. Essentially, if you're using Azure AD, that functionality is already built in. That feature is already built into Azure Active Directory, where they won't allow things like password one or P @ $, word one, things of that nature. And you can also extend the Microsoft Azure password protection to your on-premises as well. If you have on-premises domain controllers, there's password protection that you can deploy on-premise that would also allow you to set up a known banned list of words, and it could be regional things, sports teams from where you're located, company name, things like that, and that can be enabled first in an audit mode, so you can see exactly what passwords are being used, and then switch to an enforcement mode later on. Another strategy for today is using password managers. Now, this doesn't mean you have to deploy enterprise-grade password managers for everyone, because not everyone may need it. There may be particularly vulnerable teams, such as finance, that are still accessing applications where you cannot do single sign-on. Maybe it's a banking application that they're logging into to do bank reconciliation, payments, things of that nature. But they're reusing the same password, or the entire team is using the same password. A password manager, of course, can allow you to securely store a password and only share it out with those that have a need to know. And I added avoiding browser-based password managers. Not that there's anything inherently necessarily wrong with them. Some of them are pretty good, but the fact is that unless you're centrally managing or have standardized on one particular browser, users could be using Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, and they could have passwords among all those different browsers. And again, it becomes an issue of, if they want to, be able to use it across multiple devices, now you're having to export those passwords out, which are exported in clear text, and then having to report them just becomes another liability. So a good enterprise-grade password manager, of course, the icons on the screen are the logos from various companies. LastPass, KeyPass, 1Password. These are just some of the few out there. Could be good additions, again, in very targeted areas for your organization. Management of privilege and service accounts. So for service accounts, one thing that we have been seeing recently an interest in is moving to, well, first doing a discovery and finding out the service accounts that are in your environment, because that can become an unwieldy task to understand all the service accounts, who owns those service accounts, what are they used for. But we have had experience in helping organizations go through that process, kind of normalize it, and then rationalize it, and then put strategies in place to better manage them. But just switching from the user type object for service accounts to group managed service accounts. This is a technology, a feature of Windows Server that's been around since Server 2012. And with managed service accounts, the R2 version of 2012 gave us group managed service accounts, where service account can be used across, for instance, SQL clusters or other types of solutions that may have multiple nodes in a cluster that need to use the same account. A group managed service account, yes, while it is still technically password based, that password is managed by Active Directory, and it is rotated on a regular basis. It is long and cryptic, and no one knows what it is. Again, it's managed by the directory itself. And for privileged accounts, there are a slew of PAM solutions out there. These are just a few on the screen. You have Secret Server, Thycotic, now Delinea with the recent merger that they went through. Savient has a cloud PAM solution. BeyondTrust, CyberArk, of course, is a well-known name. And the purple icon there is Azure AD's Privileged Identity Management solution, which allows you to enable privileged identity, just in time administrative capabilities for a number of privileged roles that exist in Azure Active Directory. So if you have, for that particular use, for instance, you need an Azure AD Premium P2 license, but again, that can be targeted. It does not have to be for the entire organization, because that could be a cost concern there. But if there are 15 people in your IT organization or your security organization that have a need to be a global admin or an Exchange admin or a SharePoint admin, you can purchase licensing just for those users, and they'll be able to elevate their privileges on an as-needed basis and not keep permanent elevated privileges, which could be, of course, a risk. The other thing you could do, of course, is modernizing identity and apps. So by moving to a cloud-based identity platform, you're able to achieve the scale that the cloud provides, or get the benefits that the cloud provides in receiving signals and providing your users and your other service principals, which include apps and your devices, with a single strong identity. So if you have an on-prem solution, let's say you're federated with Office 365 or Google Workspace or other collaboration and productivity apps out there, and you're still using something like ADFS, really start to think about migrating to a cloud-based identity solution. Of course, there are major, the major ones out there. Of course, Okta, Microsoft has Azure AD, Google has their Google Identity as well. Of course, in our case, we're going to spend some time talking about Azure AD because it can provide that platform for being able to consolidate and modernizing your apps and your identity infrastructure. And for the on-premise question, that comes up often too. Well, if I do migrate to Azure AD, I still have all these on-premise applications. I'm still using Active Directory as the identity provider there. What do I do about those? Well, Azure AD does provide the Azure AD application proxy, which essentially can take your on-premises applications and allow Azure AD to be the identity provider for those applications. Essentially, it's a server, Windows server that you would install, and it can be installed in a HA type scenario, and for load balancing and for fault tolerance. But essentially, it creates an outbound TLS connection to Azure AD, and the application proxy service, and it will provide support, single sign-on support for header-based, form or password-based, integrated Windows authentication, SAML, and also for remote desktop gateway workloads. And that way, you don't have to have kind of a bifurcated environment where users are signing in to third-party SaaS apps, single sign-in with Azure AD, and then your on-premises still has to be managed either through LDAP or Active Directory. You can have those applications all going through the same identity provider. And for those that have some of these partner devices and appliances deployed in their environments, Microsoft has worked with these partners to come up with what's known as the Secure Hybrid Access Partnerships. So F5, Citrix, Kemp for the application delivery controllers, and VPN and software-defined perimeter partners like Palo Alto and Cisco and others. You can use those investments that you may already have to, again, be able to accomplish the same thing. Take those on-premise applications, proxy them through these devices to Azure AD. And as you can see, there's a broad range of legacy protocol support like Kerberos, header-based, NTLM, LDAP, etc. Again, what you get from that is better security, right? All of your signals, all of your authentication signals are going through a single door with that identity provider. You get seamless access for your users, and you get reduced costs and increased IT efficiency. And again, I want to emphasize, I am highlighting Azure Active Directory. That's what we're very familiar with as a Microsoft partner. But if you have another identity provider, cloud-based, such as Okta in your environment, a lot of these things can be accomplished with that. I know Okta, for instance, has the Access Gateway, which is an on-premise solution that it does exactly the same thing that the Azure AD App Proxy can do, right? Securing those on-premises applications through the Okta Universal Directory, and again, achieving that single strong identity and single security control plane, right? We know identity is a new control plane, and those cloud-based identity platforms are designed to do just that. And what we're trying to accomplish, of course, is moving away from post-it note password management, right? We know, as I said before, Rome wasn't built in a day. You're not going to get rid of all your passwords today, but we want to get away from what we see here, right? People posting their passwords on sticky notes all over the place. As the stats mentioned, 57% of employees have scribbled their passwords on sticky notes, and then 67%, according to the same survey, have admitted to losing them, right? We want to move away from that and instead move on to this single sign-on experience, right, where users are able to log into their devices today, and today they may still be using a password. We're going to start talking a little bit about how to move away from that, but they can log into their device, but now have single sign-on to all of their applications, right? They have a centralized app portal with Azure AD. You have the My Applications portal that can display all the applications that the user has been assigned. And then from here, they can launch those applications and never have to worry about entering a password, because that's part of the strategy, is to start making it so users are entering passwords less and less, and it starts to become a thing of the past, right? Now, before we move forward, I just want to launch one poll question here. I'm going to open this poll. It's about MFA. I'm just curious as to the audience here and your experience in deploying an MFA solution. We'll give this a few minutes here, or rather a few seconds. Okay, appreciate that. Yeah, so we see, I mean, good news is most of you have deployed MFA solutions, so that is good to hear. But now let's transition and talk about passwordless authentication, right? Starting that journey. What is passwordless auth? Well, let's start with what it's not, right? In our current environment with passwords, we know passwords are essentially shared secrets. And a shared secret is something that the user inputs in onto their device that gets transmitted over the wire to a server that has a database that has the hash of that secret. Of course, nothing is going over clear text. It's still a hash. But in the case of Active Directory, as an example, it's an MD5 hash, right? That's doing that hashing, which is an older hashing algorithm known to have collisions and can easily be using rainbow table attacks or any other method where, as long as the attacker has enough compute resources and some time, it's not very difficult to crack that code, as it were, right? And then along the way, of course, there's issues with keyloggers being able to detect those, the passwords that's being inputted, phishing, which is a huge problem, compromised emails. Most of the attacks that I've been part of in terms of doing forensics and determining the root cause have been through phishing. There's password guessing, there's man-in-the-middle attacks that can do sniffing on the wire. And of course, there's just the stolen database. We see those all the time, dumps out on the internet that have those shared secrets, and now that password is essentially no longer providing the security, no matter how complex it is, it's been found. And so a passwordless authentication model, right? Number one, it promises to remove that attack vector of the standalone password because without a shared secret, the input, and that could be a biometric, it could be an inference who the person is. It could still be a what you know, but in this case, it would be something like a PIN, which is not transmitted over the wire, which is secured using a trusted platform module on the device that only works for that device. Think of it like the PIN, your PIN and your ATM debit card, where you do need both of those things. It could be one-time passcodes. In some cases, it could be magic links. You see this more in B2C scenarios, where instead of providing or allowing users to sign into an application with a password, they're sent a magic link that is good for one time only to their email, and they can click on that. Or it could be, as mentioned before, using soft tokens like an authenticator type app, Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, Duo, any of those things that can accept a push notification or some type of number matching where the user has to input something on the screen that matches what they're seeing. Those are all the passwordless authentication models that we're talking about, right? Again, moving away from shared secrets and instead to a model where that access is only allowed on a trusted device through asymmetric key pairs. And also mentioned too, it also includes certificate-based authentication. That is a form of passwordless authentication because it also, again, requires a trusted device that's being issued by a trusted root server. And the main thing there is, of course, protecting that root server and those root certificates. So one model or one option for this is Windows Hello. We'll spend a few minutes talking about Windows Hello because we know Windows is still predominantly used in a lot of enterprises across many verticals. And so Windows Hello for Business provides that passwordless authentication. Windows Hello for Business by default is a strong two-factor sign-on experience because it uses the what you know or the what you are. It could be a PIN on a device, Windows device, hardware device that has a TPM module in it, or a biometric, Face ID, fingerprint, and it requires the device itself, again, which can be managed, which can be set up to essentially, be trusted to access that particular resource. Windows Hello uses that asymmetric key pair authentication model, and you can deploy it in a number of different deployment models, which we'll talk about in some detail. And as mentioned, the trust models can be either key, certificate, or now there's a new trust model called Clouded, which again we'll spend a few minutes in some detail talking about. the flow for Windows Hello, essentially, let me just get my pointer here. So in a typical Windows Hello for Business flow, authentication flow, you have a user on a device, Windows 10, Windows 11 device, on hardware that has a TPM 2.0 module in it that is securing that private key. That user enters that gesture. That gesture could, again, be the PIN that they enter, or it could be a biometric. That is then, if it's the first time that this asymmetric key pair can be created, or it's providing that identity to the identity provider, which can be Active Directory. So if you're doing an on-premise deployment only, it could be Active Directory along with the various components that are required for that type of deployment. Azure Active Directory, Microsoft accounts. So if you have a Microsoft account, last year Microsoft made passwordless available for anyone with Hotmail, Outlook, Live. I know I turned my Live account into a passwordless authentication method. So it works for that, or it could be other identity providers as well that you can leverage this with. So in that flow, that first process, entering that gesture, is one of these two things, right? And then that token is issued. So the identity provider is going to issue that authentication token to the device, and then the resources that the user is accessing have been set up to trust tokens that are issued from that identity provider. The deployment methods for Windows Hello for Business, there are three. There's the cloud-only deployment option. And that model is for organizations that have only cloud identity. So you have no on-premise, you're fully in the cloud, Azure Active Directory or another cloud-based solution is your identity provider. Your devices are Azure AD joined, and you're accessing all Office 365 workloads, third-party workloads. And because you have no on-premises resources, you do not need certificates for things like VPNs, or because everything has been deployed in Azure. Hybrid is probably where most are going to lie today, this hybrid model, which is good for if you're federated with Azure Active Directory, you're synchronizing your identities using Azure AD Connect, you're hosting applications in Azure Active Directory, and you want that single sign-on user experience for both on-premise and Azure Active Directory resources. And then there's the on-premise only, which is meant for organizations that do not have any cloud identities or use applications or applications hosted in Azure AD. Everything is on-prem, as the name suggests. Then the trust types, there's three different trust types: key trust, certificate trust, and the latest one, which was just announced, still in preview this year, was cloud trust. Key trust, some of the prerequisites if you're deploying this model with in a hybrid deployment. Hybrid Azure AD joined devices is a requirement. You will need one or more Windows Server 2016 domain controllers in the environment. You do need a PKI. I didn't call it out specifically here, but because you need certificates for those domain controllers, and it's only for the domain controllers that you need to issue certificates. Certificates are not issued to end users. Again, you will need a PKI and that particular version of domain controllers or later. You can deploy it in any environment running Windows Server 2008 R2 or later as domain controllers, and you will need to be syncing your identities to the cloud. Certificate trust. So in this model, some of the prerequisites, again, hybrid Azure AD joined devices and Azure AD joined devices. For those, if you have a mix, you need an enterprise PKI, and the minimum version that's needed is Windows Server 2012 in order to use that PKI as the trust anchor. ADFS 2016 as the certificate registration authority. So you may be authenticating against Azure AD, but your devices will need to be registered against ADFS 2016, Certificate Registration Authority. For the certificate trust, you can deploy this in a Windows Server 2008 environment as well, but you will need Windows Server 2016 or later as the schema. So you have to make sure your schema is extended to Windows Server 2016 because it needs to be able to contain those attributes that are provided by the certificates. You also need Azure AD device write-back enabled because if you have devices that are registered or joined in Azure AD, primarily, if they're not hybrid joined, they need to be written back because Active Directory will need to know about them. So that write-back needs to be enabled, and that is an Azure AD premium feature that you will need to have. And certificate trust and issuing certificate, if you have RDP and you want to deploy passwordless for your RDP environment, then certificate trust is going to be the best model for you. There is a way to do it with key trust, but the best option, overall is for passwordless RDP is to use certificates, because then certificates itself can be used as the authentication to RDP sessions. Then finally, there's Cloud Trust. So this Cloud Trust, again, is the newer topology that can be leveraged. And it essentially is using Azure AD Kerberos to issue the TGT, the ticket granting tickets in Kerberos to Active Directory. There is an object is created in your Active Directory representing Azure AD for Azure AD Kerberos, but it's going to leverage that. So you don't need any PKI. You will need, as far as your clients, when you patched Windows 10, 21H2, or Windows 11 and later, you need fully patched Windows Server 2016 or later domain controllers. You would have to deploy seamless SSO in your environment, essentially using the Azure AD Kerberos PowerShell modules. And your device management can be group policy, or you can use cloud-based management using Intune mobile device management. And for the first time, for that device registration, when that public and private key pair is issued, that client does need line of sight to domain controllers. So if most of your workers, if you're going to deploy this and your workers are remote, which a lot of us are, then you would have to have some line of sight to the domain controller, either through VPN or through the obvious measure of them being on premise on the same network where those domain controllers can be seen, so that registration can occur. Where you can't use Cloud Trust today, if you're on premises only, Cloud Trust is not the deployment model for you. RDP and VDI scenarios using supplied credentials. Again, as mentioned, you can use it with remote credential guard, or if you have a certificate enrolled in the Windows Hello for Business container, and there are a lot of good documentation Microsoft has provided on how to do that. If you have any scenarios that require a certificate for authentication, then again, Cloud Trust is not going to be the model you choose. Can't use Cloud Trust for run as. That is not an option. And signing in with Cloud Trust on a hybrid Azure AD joint device without previously signing in with DC connectivity. So that goes back to that other point I made about needing that line of sight. So you would need to have that registration first. After that, it's no longer required. You can use it, but you need it initially for that registration to occur. Okay, that was one way to move to passwordless, again, deploying Windows Hello for Business. There is a lot there that needs to be considered. There's deployment planning guides for deploying Windows Hello for Business. Again, depending on your scenario. And of course, Oxford Computer Group would love to engage with you in helping you determine that. But again, there's resources available online in the Microsoft Docs library that detail what you need to consider before deploying Windows Hello for Business in your environment. Another way to accomplish passwordless is by using FIDO2. The FIDO2 standard is actually made up of multiple specifications which define different parts of the authentication flow. So you might have heard of WHAB Authn. That's the first spec, and that defines a web API that allows web pages to accept strong cryptographic credentials through the browser's JavaScript. And it aims to integrate well with existing web platforms by reusing existing web specifications where possible. Now, this is not something that's just widely available. Some websites support the WHAB Authn specification today, and you can, if you have these hardware security keys by Authtrends or Yubico or Fashion, you can begin leveraging those. The second specification is the client to authenticator, or CTAP, and that's an application layer protocol for communication between an authenticator and a host computer that wishes to use these capabilities for strong user authentication. Now, Windows as a platform has implemented this specification of CTAP, and there are exposed set of platform APIs for browsers to leverage that functionality too. Some of the partners, again, that support FIDO2, I mentioned them before: Yubico, TrustKey, HID, Fashion, Authtrend. These are all different hardware security providers that allow you to begin using FIDO2 as an additional method. And these can be used in conjunction with Windows Hello for Business as well. In fact, in my Surface 3 laptop that I'm using today, I primarily use my biometric, my Face ID, but I have a Yubico key permanently inserted in my single USB-C slot, so it does cause a little bit of an issue there. But I use that as well for authentication, and it's also a strong two-factor method, because the security key itself also has a PIN that I have to enter and then touch in order to gain access to my laptop. Now, some have asked, okay, this is great, passwordless is great, but what about that onboarding experience? What can we do there? Because when you're onboarding a new user, it seems like the only thing you can do is issue them a password, and then maybe after that they can start using passwordless. But for that, onboarding experience, Microsoft recently, this was actually March of 2021, it was announced, and it's in GA. If you're not familiar with it, temporary access pass. It's a time-limited code for passwordless credentials setup and also account recovery. So if you're onboarding a new user, you can configure a temporary access pass that they will use one time to log in. And then after that, they will use the other methods that you have enabled in your environment, whether it's Windows Hello for Business or a hardware security key in order to access those resources. And this enables you to have that end-to-end passwordless user journey, and also for remote onboarding, which a lot of us are doing these days. Right? Users are never going to an office; they're getting mailed a device, and if you're using, for instance, Intune for deployment using Autopilot, they're entering their credentials, and in this case, they would enter that temporary access pass. Autopilot would provision that laptop, and then going forward, they would continue to use Windows Hello for Business passwordless authentication. And again, just want to highlight that this is in general availability. It's been around since spring of last year. What about support for non-Windows environments? Well, this is not an area that I'm particularly well versed in, but just looking at some of the available resources, Yubico, using a YubiKey, they have an article published on how you can use YubiKeys as a smart card in Mac OS. So you can, and this is for not for SSH, not for terminal type things, but actually authenticating into the operating system itself. You can use Yubico as a form of a smart card to do that. And same with Linux, basically the same. That Linux also has support for certificates, in SSH, which SSHing to resources to be able to access the operating system itself as well. I also saw Jamf. If you're using Jamf as a management platform for your Mac OS environments, They also have a solution around passwordless for Mac OS. And then there are other third parties, some that I'm not really familiar with, but there are other third parties that support passwordless using phone-based, right? So if you have a phone, they have a client that you can install, you register it, and you can leverage that for RDP, VDI type scenarios as well. So that's the what. So how do you begin transitioning to passwordless? So Microsoft published a document, a series of documents, talks about the strategy, the Microsoft passwordless strategy, which is a four-step process. And it begins first with developing password replacement offerings, right? Putting these out there to users that want to use them. Perhaps you can select power users, a group of pilot users that would make a good test bed in your environment. But you want to start deploying these alternatives that coexist with passwords nicely, such as Windows Hello for Business and FIDO. These offerings will continue to coexist with your password-based environment. However, some workflows and applications will still need to be password, as we mentioned. So you want to leverage those other strategies for managing those and securing your environment. In this early stage, the goal is to just make an alternative way to sign in available to your users. Step 2 is reducing user visible password surface area. So in your environment, you want to try to eliminate as much as possible any workflows that are asking for passwords. And again, that could be very simply from leveraging a password manager, or if you're using, for instance, Azure Active Directory, same sign-on capabilities, which uses password vaulting. You can do that in Azure AD, set up an application that still requires a password, but you essentially have masked it from the user. There's a plugin that you can add to Edge or Chrome browser that can automatically enter that password for the user, and the user would not have to know what the password is. Again, the goal here is to start reducing the password surface area. And this can start also if you're onboarding new users, and you can start deploying things like temporary access pass. New users will start getting into the mode of very rarely having to enter passwords to access their resources. The goal here is to achieve a state where the users know that they have a password, but they never use it. And this helps decondition users from providing a password anytime a password prompt shows up on their computer. So starts to eliminate the phishing vulnerability, because when they see a password prompt, it'll be very unusual for them, and they will raise alarms and ask questions first before entering a password if they haven't forgotten it and still know what it is. Step 3 is transitioning to passwordless deployment. So once you've reduced that visible password surface area, the next step is for your organization to transition to passwordless deployment and move to a world where a user never types their password, never changes their password, and does not even know what their password is. And that means deploying policies so that users never see the password credential provider on Windows during the out-of-box experience when provisioning a new device, on sign-in, or in settings. In this particular environment, the user signs in to Windows 10 or 11 using Windows Hello for Business and enjoys a single sign-on to Azure and Active Directory. And if the user is forced to authenticate, they use Windows Hello for Business or a FIDO2 security key, Face ID, some biometric, something but a password. And then finally, you can eliminate, step 4, eliminate passwords from the identity directory. And that's sort of the end goal, where we all want to be. You can delete passwords, or essentially override the password that's in the user's attribute with something very long and cryptic and that nobody knows and nobody cares what it is, because you have much better methods of authenticating into the environment. This is just a journey map to removing passwords from daily use, right? So we talked about some of these things, enabling MFA as a start. Those are things that you can do today, right? Moving to SaaS apps to Azure AD, deploying Windows Hello for Business, enabling Authenticator. app sign-in for those sensitive users in Passwordless, and there is a new feature. I think maybe a month to a month and a half ago was announced. Alex Simons, who's on the identity team at Microsoft, on the blog, posted the authentication methods now in Azure AD. You can force passwordless, so you can force that number matching, and you can also force the context, so the user can see when they do get a prompt on their authenticator app where that sign-in is coming from, right? And to prevent those phishing attempts or social engineering attempts to get users to just approve a sign-in. The next 3 months, right, start leveraging conditional access to those sensitive apps. And again, we're saying conditional access, that's an Azure AD terminology, but if you're using, for instance, Okta has adaptive MFA. Essentially, you want to set up an intelligent policy engine that can determine risk criteria for that user signing in, and make intelligent decisions as to whether they need to step up their authentication, whether they may need to re-authenticate because there was something odd detected in the way that they're signing in, right? But the point is, enable that MFA, and it's important. The adaptive MFA or conditional access in your environment, very important that you have good policies around what you're allowing to connect to your enterprise and access resources. Because, for instance, if you allow users to use an authenticator app on their phone, but it is their phone, it is not a corporate managed device, there really is no way to enforce that the user have a PIN or biometric in order to access their phone. Now, the Microsoft Authenticator app does have app lock enabled by default, which requires you to do Face ID or enter your PIN or Touch ID to access the app lock, but that's something that the user can disable. There is currently no way to centrally manage that. I know Microsoft has been working on it, but it's still not available today. And so you want to make sure that, for instance, if you're using conditional access, do you have as an access control that the device that's trying to sign in, that's trying to authenticate, is compliant, or that it's hybrid Azure AD joined, or some other criteria to make sure that if that device is lost or stolen, that phone, I'm talking about the phone with the authenticator app on it, if it's lost or stolen, and you have a passwordless topology enabled, that the wrong person is not going to be able to gain access. Some other things, okay, so later on, after 3 months, right, adding some additional device-based factor like hybrid join or Intune management, modernizing your custom apps, that's also very important, right? Talk about those legacy apps. There is going to be a process at some point that you want to modernize them and get them to start using modern authentication protocols. Rolling out Windows Hello for Business, even if it's only with a PIN, no biometric, no hardware security keys, just a simple PIN. A PIN is still better than the password because it's not a shared secret. And then finally, looking beyond, right, the end goal to stop using passwords. Same thing, said a slightly different way, a few bullet points, right? Enabling FIDO2 for those security conscious user groups. You may have certain groups, HR, finance, legal, that may need stronger authentication. So perhaps those are good groups to start issuing FIDO2 security keys and training them on how to use them. Rolling out passwordless methods, temporary access pass, Windows Hello for Business, and authenticator phone sign-in. And that phone sign-in, currently, you can only have one device, one phone registered. If you have multiple accounts, Microsoft accounts, and you want to be able to do phone sign-in, you can only have one device registered. That is changing according to latest news from Alex Simons on the blog, that they're going to be enabling that for multiple devices. The insights and reporting tools within Azure AD provide it's a great tool for tracking the deployment, seeing how far you've gotten, where things stand, and then using APIs to manage all credentials. Again, that takes modernizing applications using these available APIs, but again, those can be part of your goals. Now, how can we help? So Microsoft has some what they call build to intent workshops, and we participate in those workshops. Everything that we talked about here, plus more, is covered in that securing identities workshop, and these workshops are free for qualified customers. So we would have to nominate you as a customer and just ensure that you qualify, but essentially it's about 3 days of consulting to give you an overview of what happens during that. We first look at the scope, gather the key information of your identity landscape and your executive sponsor and business stakeholders. During the envisioning phase, we'll help you rethink your approach to foundational security by introducing an end-to-end solution to ensure all apps are protected. And then we finally work on key findings during the workshop, provide some reporting around that, and help you determine what your strategy is going to be next. So again, that's something that we encourage our customers to tap into, since there are, again, no cost to you as a client. And it's a good way to really just start strategizing and start, in POC, we don't deploy anything in production, but in proof of concept type modes, be able to deploy some of these solutions. That's all I had for today. We do have time for some questions. Let me see. Let's see. So we have one question. What does it mean that KeyTrust uses raw key pairs? So mentioned before, in the KeyTrust topology, where you do need Windows 2016 domain controllers, the end device or the user is not issued a certificate. The key pair is stored on the device using that trusted platform module, and during that authentication flow in Windows Hello, that is the key, the public key that's registered on the domain controllers is what is leveraged in that scenario. I don't see any other questions. Of course, you can always feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to further deep dive into this topic with you. But if there's no other questions, I will bid you a great day, and we hope to see you soon.